Welcome to Witness to Yesterday, the Canadian history podcast of the Champlain Society. My name is Larry Ostola. If you live in Canada, you've probably been on it more times than you can count, perhaps without even realizing it. It's a vital national artery stretching for thousands of kilometers, linking us from coast to coast. But despite this, it has never really taken on the mythological status of the Canadian Pacific Railway. I'm referring, of course, to the Trans-Canada Highway. And my guest today has delved into the fascinating history of its construction, from its conception to its completion, and the many twists and turns that resulted. I'm very pleased to be joined today by Craig Baird, who's the author of a new book titled Canada's Main Street, the epic story of the Trans-Canada Highway, which was published by Sutherland House in 2025. Craig Baird is a former journalist with a passionate interest in Canadian history. In 2019, he started the Canadian History X podcast, and since then, it has become a full-time pursuit and has expanded into the realm of videos and social media. Craig, many thanks for joining me on the show today.
Oh, well, thanks for having me.
While I was reading the book, I was really struck by the rapid increase in the number of cars in the early 20th century, given the state of the roads at the time, and it's something that really seems to have taken off.
Well, it was very much a patchwork where we didn't have a road being built across the country. It was a road here, a road there, usually around the major cities. And then everywhere else, it was just dirt trails. So it took a long time before those roads started to connect with each other. And it was kind of each province just working on roads. So if you had a premier who didn't really like the automobile, a good example would be Prince Edward Island, which banned the automobile for several years, then you wouldn't have those road systems. But in other places, Manitoba was one that really led the way with building proper roads. You'd have really great roads. And it also depended on your landscape. Obviously, British Columbia is a lot more difficult to build a road in than, say, Saskatchewan. And over time, those roads started to connect at the borders, and slowly you kind of got a patchwork of roads leading almost across the country. There were still areas where it was just easier to drive into the United States and just bypass a huge chunk of, say, Ontario or British Columbia.
You referred briefly to the state of the roads, and in your book, you highlight what I'm going to call an epic attempt to cross the country by car in 1912. That's a very long time ago. Two gentlemen by the name of Thomas Wilby and Jack Haney set out to claim a prize which was known as the Todd Medal. So I wonder if you could tell us first what the Todd Medal was and how did their trip go?
Well, the Todd Medal was created by Alfred Todd, and he would eventually become the mayor of Victoria, BC. And his goal with the Todd Medal was the first person or the first individuals to drive across the country completely. So that's only driving, no taking boats, no putting it on the train or anything like that, would receive the Todd Medal. He thought that it would be awarded within a few years, and it was actually awarded well after he died. It took decades before this happened. But the first individuals to, quote unquote, drive across the country were Thomas Wilby and Jack Haney. So Thomas Wilby was a British travel writer, very pompous, very believing in, the greatness of the British Empire, looked down on Canada heavily. And the other person was Jack Haney, and he was the mechanic. And these two individuals absolutely hated each other. Thomas Wilby would just always refer to Jack Haney as the chauffeur or the driver in the book, never by name. And even though Thomas Wilby is kind of the person that they say drove across Canada first, he didn't do any driving. He sat in the back writing in his notebook while Jack Haney did all the driving, got them out of ruts. And when it broke down, he was fixing it and, making sure that they had enough gas. So Jack Haney was really the hero of the story. And when they're driving across the country, they start in Halifax, they take some water, and then they make their way across the country. And pretty much the whole way, Thomas Wilby is just criticizing Canada. At one point, he's I believe in Ottawa, just trying to get a cup of tea, and he hates the tea. So he goes to another place, tries the tea there, hates that, goes to another place and gets coffee and hates that. And he doesn't like the immigrants that Canada's bringing in. Like, Thomas Wilby is not, not a great person. But they eventually do make their way across Canada, but they're not awarded the Todd Medal because there was no road through the Lake Superior area. So they actually had to take a boat to what would be then Fort William and Port Arthur, and it's now Thunder Bay. So they took a boat there, and then they were able to go through the prairies And then when they get into BC, they have to actually put it onto a train and transport it that way for a little bit. Or sorry, they had to do that after they got to Fort William, and then they transported by train to Winnipeg. And there are points where they're actually driving on the railroad track in British Columbia. And one of the stories I write about is that they're actually sitting on the running board holding out lanterns while they're driving on the railroad track at night, just hoping a train's not going to come by. So because they couldn't drive the whole distance physically and they had to take the train and the boat, they weren't awarded the Todd Medal. But it's generally considered to be the first two individuals to actually drive for the most part across Canada.
Just a really striking story and like quite an undertaking back at the start of the 20th century. But speaking of the start of the 20th century, there had been some early consideration given to the construction of a national highway, but nothing really happened until the late 1940s when the thinking about the construction of a transnational highway began to happen. And then construction was initiated in 1950. What do you think was the impetus that finally led to the start of construction? I mean, was it post-war enthusiasm? Was it a can-do attitude? The idea that this is a growing country and that we needed to get things like this done? I mean, what was it exactly?
Well, there were a few factors that came into play. The one was the end of the Second World War. And obviously, during the Second World War, a lot of soldiers are driving and they're seeing the benefits of having vehicles. In Canada, the use of automobiles is exploding, and many people are starting to buy them, especially after the war. You also had William Lyon Mackenzie King, who was prime minister for 21 years. He leaves office and is replaced by Louis Saint Laurent. And Louis Saint Laurent sees the benefits of having some sort of road system. And then also you had families starting to pop up. You know, the baby boomers were just being born, and provinces in the country were looking at like, well, we can actually create some kind of tourism for this, because what was happening was people would drive through the prairies, and when they get to Winnipeg, they go south, and then they drive through the United States and then come back up in the St. Lawrence River Valley. And so you're robbing a lot of areas of money from tourists, from Canadians who can't drive across the country. So there was a lot of other projects that were starting to pop up at this point. In a few years, you'd had the St. Lawrence Seaway, you would have the Trans-Canada Pipeline. So all these projects were starting to come about. And it was decided that, it was about time that Canada did have a road going across the nation. The United States had its interstates, and Canada just had dirt roads and paved roads around cities and was really lagging behind the times. So that's when you get the Trans-Canada Highway Act in 1949, which is kind of the beginning of the Trans-Canada Highway.
And construction actually begins in 1950, right?
Yeah, in some places it's kind of all scattered about. Some places would begin in about 1950, other places wouldn't. Nova Scotia didn't begin for a few years because they couldn't decide where they wanted the highway to go. And Quebec, which was still under the thumb of Maurice Duplessis, was not even signing on to this until 1960-61 when the Quiet Revolution starts, and then they sign on. So it was kind of a scattered approach, but the goal was to have the highway done by about 1957.
Okay, so in about 7 years. One of the fascinating parts of the story was the story of the selection of the route that the TransCanada was gonna follow, and it turns out that that was a major sticking point that was actually left up to the provinces. I mean, if you'd asked me before I read your book, I would have said, "Oh, well, the national government decided that it was gonna take this route and away you go," but that's not exactly what happened, and in the book, you include a great quote from the Calgary Herald from 1949, which reads as follows: "We had hoped that our country had progressed far enough along the road to adult nationhood that issues like this could be debated and decided on a national basis and not according to sectional interests." Not surprisingly, sectional interests won the day. What happened and how did the selection of the route play into federal provincial relations?
Yeah, it is kind of wild to think, because when you think about the CPR being built, it was more or less saying this is where it's going, and that was it. But with the Trans-Canada Highway, yeah, it is each province, and I like thinking of that today. I can't imagine the provinces agreeing on that now, because everybody wants to. A perfect example is Alberta, where I live. Edmonton and Calgary, you're going to have members of the same party saying, "Oh, we got to put it through Edmonton. Oh, we got to put it through Calgary." So the federal government, I think, kind of passed the buck a bit by saying, well, the provinces have to decide. But at the same time, highways were a provincial matter. And by letting the provinces decide, that was just part of the agreement. And really, on the East Coast, it's not hard. no, it's not hard to choose where the route's going to go in Prince Edward Island. Even Newfoundland, with the way it goes around the island, it makes sense. And same with Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. Obviously, in Quebec, it's going to go along the St. Lawrence River. But as you start going west, it gets a bit more difficult. So when you get farther west of Toronto and Ottawa, do you go through northern Ontario or do you go along the Lake Superior route? Obviously, the Lake Superior route is the better one because it's very picturesque, so it's perfect for tourism. And then once you get to the western side of Manitoba, then it splits. And do you go through Saskatoon and do you go through Regina? And that then decides, do you go through Edmonton, Calgary, or Lethbridge? And then that decides, do you go through Jasper, Banff, or the Crow's Nest Pass? So the decisions have to begin in the east before you even know where you're going. And there's another quote in my book that I really liked where somebody said, if we put the highway through every town that wanted it, it would be zigzagging all over the map. It would be up and down, and it would just be terrible. So it's pretty clear it's going to go through Regina because it is the capital, but Edmonton's fighting to get the highway, and they form the Yellowhead Association, and they even take like a convoy from Edmonton to Kamloops, I believe. It's just to prove that this Yellowhead route can be used. And Edmonton fought tooth and nail to get it. But I think in many ways it was already kind of a foregone conclusion that it's going to go through Calgary so it can go through Banff. Because as part of the agreement, the original agreement at least, 50% of the cost is paid by the province, 50% by the federal government, except in national parks, where the federal government pays for 100% of the cost. So it becomes pretty clear it's probably going to go through Banff because that's a big tourist spot. You're trying to drive people towards it. It's also kind of following where the CPR goes. But yeah, you had an election in 1949, and I really enjoyed when I was writing about the election because you would have candidates in the same party, for example, say the Liberal Party in Alberta, and one would say, absolutely, we're going to put it through Edmonton. And then another Liberal candidate in Calgary would say, we're putting it through Calgary. Well, how can you be part of the same party and you're saying two different things about where the route's going to go? And it was a kind of a really interesting part. Probably one of the more enjoyable parts of the book for me was just writing about the selection of this route and how long it took. Because a lot of delayed the choice. They delayed till after elections, so they didn't anger one side or the other, especially in Alberta, where you had three possible routes.
A few minutes ago, you were referring to the efforts that Edmonton and some of the leading citizens in Edmonton deployed to get the Trans-Canada to have a route through that city. But they weren't the only ones. There was another effort that really struck me, and it was something called the Project Michipicoten. I wonder if you could tell us about that effort to get the Trans-Canada Highway to run in a certain direction, because I tell you, I really found it quite amusing.
Well, in an area called Wawa, there was no real road connection. It was just plane or boat or train. And I don't even think plane unless you were landing on the water. And so they wanted to show essentially the provincial and federal governments that it was possible to build through and connect Wawa and the Lake Superior route as part of the Trans-Canada Highway. So this was a group of men who just left the community and walked, I think, for about 2 weeks to show that, it is possible to make this journey. And if we can walk through it, then it's going to be easy enough to build a road through it. And it actually did get a lot of press. I don't know how much it played into selecting the route. I think Lake Superior was going to be the route because it's a very beautiful drive. Nothing against Northern Ontario, also a beautiful area, but you're really trying to draw on those American tourists. And if you keep the highway as close to the border as possible, that's how you're going to do it, especially along Lake Superior. But yeah, it was just one of those citizen initiatives, kind of like you saw in Edmonton, of people just trying to tip the scales a little bit to get the highway built through their area, because obviously it would help their community. They were much more successful than Edmonton was. Edmonton, unfortunately, obviously did not get the Trans-Canada Highway. It eventually got the Yellowhead Highway, which is part of the Trans-Canada Highway route, but it's not the official Trans-Canada. But yeah, that journey by these men just through the bush for a couple weeks just to prove a point was, a really cool aspect of the whole Trans-Canada story of just trying to prove something to the government.
Well, their efforts worked, I guess, because Wawa eventually did get the highway, and obviously some communities across the country benefited from its construction, but there were also others that were much less fortunate. Some communities, I was surprised to learn, even disappeared. What were some of the communities that lost out because of the selection of the route for the highway?
Well, it wasn't so much that you would lose, like the communities would just completely disappear, like say with the railroad, where if the railroad didn't go through, the town would pick up and move to where the railroad was. But there were a lot of communities that were banking on getting the highway because it would help boost the community, it would help bring in a lot of traffic. And so when the highway bypasses them, they don't quite grow to what a lot of people were foreseeing. A good example would be Maple Creek. Maple Creek is a beautiful community just near the Cypress Hills in southwestern Saskatchewan, but it is about 10 kilometers south of the highway. So it doesn't quite boom as much as, say, Medicine Hat does, which is about an hour away, which is right along the highway. If the community had been a bit farther north, it probably would have boomed quite a bit more and be a much larger community along the lines of Swift Current, which is about an hour to the east. Wawa is another example of a community that the highway was built just to the north, but then they figure out a way to get people to stop and come into the community. And that's what a lot of communities had to do. If you were close enough to the highway, how do you get people off that highway to your community? Because it doesn't go through the middle of a lot of places. It does go through the middle of the cities, like Calgary, it's 16th Avenue. It goes originally through Regina and through Ottawa. That all changes when we get a lot more vehicles and suddenly people who are on vacation don't want to be stuck in Ottawa rush hour trying to get along the highway. So you start to get ring roads going around the cities. But these smaller communities that are all banking on getting it, Northern Ontario would be a good example of that as well. A lot of those communities were hoping to get the highway and then they don't get the highway and they kind of either stagnate and just stay at a few hundred people or they just fade away. While other ones, Medicine Hat booms because it's got the highway through it. And other places, Swift Current, same thing. It becomes one of the largest cities in Saskatchewan because the highway goes right through the community.
So, even though we're talking about road construction in the 1950s, 1960s, the road builders had the benefit of some modern technology, there were still some enormous engineering challenges that they had to overcome. And two examples of that were the Rogers Pass in British Columbia and the route north of Lake Superior in Ontario that you were mentioning a few moments ago. Just how serious were the challenges that the road builders were facing, and how did they overcome them?
The challenges were very, very difficult. It very much mirrors the building of the CPR. You know, if you build through Saskatchewan, it's relatively easy to build through Saskatchewan. I think they only had to build one or two bridges versus British Columbia, where they had to build a couple dozen bridges to be able to go across gorges. And so the Rogers Pass was where it was going through in British Columbia, and you had to have things like the snow sheds because you have avalanches, and it's not a case of a train where you know when that train's going to go through and an avalanche comes through and you can get that train track cleared in time for that train. You have people on the highway constantly, so you need some way to protect them. So that's when they start building those snow sheds, which are actually really cool to drive through. Just these long tunnels that are just on the side of the mountain, and especially in the winter where you can see the snow going clear across it. But then you also have places like Lake Superior, and you're building through the Canadian Shield and blasting through granite. And when you're not blasting through granite, you're building over muskeg, and the muskeg will just sink your entire section of road, or it'll shift the road. So in many ways, they kind of learned from the builders of the CPR. They did have better technology to do it, but they were facing the exact same challenges. And that's what really leads to this long delay in getting the highway done. Like I said, it was supposed to be done in 1957. The only province that got it done in 1957 or by 1957 was Saskatchewan. And then you had Alberta and Manitoba just a few years later. But British Columbia took many years. Ontario, it didn't officially get a highway more or less through until the early 1960s. And even then, the Trans-Canada Highway had to be a certain width with certain shoulders. And a lot of this was still dirt road. And so I always find it funny when you look at John Diefenbaker and he's tamping down the asphalt and declaring the highway is open and it's finished, but it's not. It's dirt road in many places. Newfoundland wouldn't finish its portion until 1965. Quebec doesn't officially finish until the late 1960s. And it's just, there was a lot of engineering challenges. The Kansas Causeway was another good example of something that took several years to build because you're trying to connect Cape Breton Island to Nova Scotia, and that's part of the Trans-Canada Highway and was part of the agreement Nova Scotia made with the federal government. So you had these challenges clear across Canada, much easier in the prairies, but you still dealt with some issues. In Manitoba, you had gumbo and things like that you're trying to build through, and weather conditions, and then obviously Alberta is very easy until you get to the Rockies, and then it becomes much more difficult. And for some reason, they go through the Kicking Horse Pass again, even though I understand why they went through Banff, because the Kicking Horse Pass is probably one of the worst passes to build anything through, especially when you have the Crow's Nest Pass, which is much easier, and the Yellowhead Pass. But obviously, the highway's going to Calgary, you got to build it through there. And for anybody driving the Kicking Horse Pass pre like 1990,
Yeah.
it was a steep hill that you're going down. Now it's much easier, and if you don't like hikes, it's not a great pass to go through. I've driven it a few times and it's not pleasant. But yeah, there was challenges all over the place, and obviously there were people who did die. One of the bridges, the second narrow bridge in Vancouver, was part of the Trans-Canada Highway, and it suffered a collapse that killed a few dozen workers. You also had workers who they were on machinery that went off the side of a cliff, or some people were killed because of the machinery they were working with. So it wasn't as dangerous as building a railroad, but there was still a lot of dangers, and especially in the tougher terrains.
We've been talking a little bit about the engineering challenges like the ones you've just described, and construction starts mostly in 1950, although later in other places. What do you consider to be the date when it was finally completed? Because I understand it can be the subject of some debate. What do you think? When was it officially finished?
Well, I think, you can build a dirt road across the country and say it's a Trans-Canada Highway, but it isn't. It's a dirt road. And I don't agree that the Trans-Canada Highway was finished in 1962 when John Diefenbaker tamped it down. And the funny thing with that is you had actually two ceremonies to open the Trans-Canada Highway because British Columbia was in a dispute with the federal government. So a few months before John Diefenbaker did that tamp down in the Rogers Pass, you had Bennett, the premier of British Columbia, doing his own ceremony to open the highway. So two ceremonies to open the same highway within a few months of each other in pretty much the same area of British Columbia. For me personally, I would say you could either say that the Trans-Canada Highway opened in about 1970 when the tunnel under the St. Lawrence River connecting Montreal was finished, and then that technically is the highway being completed. But I like to think of it as about 1965 because that's when Newfoundland, in its drive for 65, and Joey Smallwood gets the federal government to pretty much pay for the entire highway in Newfoundland, and him and Lester B. Pearson shake hands at what's called Pearson's Peak, I believe, in Newfoundland, where the highway was finished. So I like to think of that as when the highway was done, because by that point it was mostly done across the country. It was mostly paved across the country, and technically it did now run from one coast to the other. So 1965 would be for me, certainly not 1962. I think it doesn't have the same mystique of the last spike where you're like, okay, it's done. Like we can take a train across the country now. When John Diefenbaker's doing that, and he's already at like near the end of his road as prime minister, so maybe that's part of it. But yeah, I don't consider 1962 to be when the highway was finished.
Yeah, having two ceremonies for a stretch of highway sounds awfully reminiscent to some of the things that happen these days. But anyway, Uh, one of the more amusing byproducts of the construction of the Trans-Canada was the creation of roadside attractions. No doubt an effort by small communities to get people, as you said earlier, to pull off the highway. One of the most famous is the Wawa Goose. What are some of the other ones that towns decided to put up to attract some of the tourist business?
Well, every town's going to have something to try and get people off the highway. I'm just outside of Edmonton, so within about an hour and a half of me, I have the world's largest pierogi, the world's largest mushrooms, the world's largest sausage, and then the world's largest pasanka in Vegreville. So you have all these things that are trying to get you to like go over there. But it's with the Trans-Canada Highway that we first kind of see that. And the Wawa Goose is, I think in many ways the first real roadside attraction because it is unveiled the exact same day that the highway is opened through Wawa. So they knew exactly what they were doing. They knew that Even though the highway was just to the north of the community, you build something, people stop, and then they stop and go, well, you know what, we're here. Why don't we get gas? Why don't we get something to eat? Or we've been driving for 8 hours. Why don't we go to a hotel? And so people come off the highway. So that first Wawa Goose was made of like mesh, and it was not very well made. Like it started to fall apart within a couple of years. So they replaced it with another one that lasted until 2017 or something like that. So the one that's there now is the third version, but they still have that original one on display in the community that they've restored. And it was kind of the first point where it was showing that, there are these roadside attractions to get people off the highway. This is before selfies and things like that. Obviously people use the roadside attractions for selfies now. And then they start to appear across the prairies. Probably the other famous one would be Mac the Moose and Moose Jaw, which if you're on the Trans-Canada Highway and you're driving down the highway coming to Moose Jaw, if you're not expecting it, suddenly there's this gigantic moose just off the highway. And again, the highway doesn't go through Moose Jaw. Moose Jaw's to the south of it, so it gets you off the highway. And there's a reason that there's a bunch of hotels and restaurants around Mac the Moose, because they're trying to get that traffic. And then they just start popping up all over the place. Medicine Hat has the world's largest teepee, which was part of the opening ceremonies of the 1988 Winter Olympics in Calgary. Again, getting you off the highway, because it's all about getting you to stop. And now roadside attractions are everywhere. Some are small and you won't even notice them. And some, like Mac the Moose and Wawa Goose, you stop because you know that it'll make a great picture. Husky the Muskie in Kenora is another good example of a roadside attraction to get people off that highway and get into the community. But everybody's kind of following the template that Wawa set with Wawa Goose back in about 1960.
So, Craig, we've referred to the construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway a couple of times in our conversation, and it was a monumental achievement that I think has lived on in our popular imagination in a way that the Trans-Canada Highway has not. And I'm curious to know why you think that is. I mean, maybe I missed something. Maybe it has caught on in the popular imagination. Maybe it's in a Gordon Lightfoot song. I don't know. But what do you think of that?
I think there's a couple of reasons. One probably is the Gordon Lightfoot song that he made in 1967 for the centennial. And another is somebody that kind of inspired my love of history, and who I have 49 of his 50 books behind me, and that's Pierre Burton writing The National Dream and The Last Spike. And those two books really kind of ignite a lot of interest in the Canadian Pacific Railway, and then leads to a fantastic docuseries by CBC called The National Dream, which
Hmm.
documents the building. But I think also it's maybe a bit different now, because a lot of us don't take the train. I mean, I would say maybe a quarter of the people in Canada have probably ridden on the train before, whereas everybody drives the highway. So it's something that's just always there. And you don't really think about it. If you're in Calgary and you want to go to Peter's Drive-In and get a burger and shake, you are on 16th Avenue. That's the Trans-Canada Highway. But you don't think of it as that. You don't think of the fact that you can get on 16th Avenue and drive all the way across the country and stay on that highway. The CPR has also been mythologized in many ways, because you have big figures attached to it. Sir John A. Macdonald, Sir Sanford Fleming, Sir Donald Smith. You have the story of the Chinese workers and how many sacrificed their lives to build this. You have the famous image of the last spike. And there's just so much. There's scandals related to, like, the Pacific Scandal, British Columbia threatening to leave Canada if it doesn't get that railroad eventually built. So there's just so much more stories and drama related to the CPR versus the Trans-Canada Highway, which, other than some provinces bickering about where it's going to go, there's no big scandals. There's some minor ones from contractors and stuff like that, but nothing that brings down a government like in 1873. And I think that plays a lot into it. And the CPR has been written about many times by many different people, all covering different angles of it. And Canada was already a nation. We were already almost 100 years old when the Trans-Canada Highway was finally more or less finished. We were just getting to our centennial. People were getting on the highway to drive to Expo 67, whereas the CPR was a way to really tie two ends of the country together and get British Columbia into Confederation, which eventually is followed by Alberta and Saskatchewan. And it has so much more going for it. It's like that's the big Oscar-winning movie that everybody loves, that has everything to it, and then the Trans-Canada Highway is the sequel that, it's good, but it's not as huge as the original.
Yeah, for sure. No, just a fascinating story and one that I guess, really haven't had the opportunity to think about a whole lot, as you mentioned. But to wrap up, I wanted to get to a point that you make in your conclusion, Craig, and that is that the Trans Canada Highway made a difference to the country, both economically as well as psychologically. And I'd like to ask you what you think its principal legacies are. What do you think it's meant to us?
Well, it's become part of our culture because it's the highway, Terry Fox and Rick Hansen were on. So we all have the image of the highway. But it's also before when you would take the train, you had to be on the train and the train stopped where it stopped and went where it went. But the Trans-Canada Highway is it's the river that goes across Canada, but it allows you to branch off from there. And I always tell people that it's great to be on the highway, but also get on those secondary roads and see what you find in these small town diners or small town museums. This year, actually, my dog Burton and I are going to be traveling across the country for 2 months, and I'm going to be on the Trans Canada Highway. And that's something a lot of people can do. It's for many a rite of passage to see the country and drive across and meet new people and see how there's all these different cultures within Canada. I'm in Alberta, and right now there's the unfortunate separatist movement. And I think if a lot more people would leave Alberta and take these journeys and visit people in Quebec or Ontario or Nova Scotia or Newfoundland and see that, we're a vast nation, but we're all Canadians. That's kind of what the Trans Canada Highway can do. It's your conduit to learning more about your country, its history, its culture, its amazing landscape. And all you have to do is take your car and go onto the highway. You don't have to buy a ticket. You just got to have gas money, which I know these days is not cheap, but you can just go and you don't have to drive across the country, but you can get on the Trans Canada Highway and drive from Calgary to Winnipeg if you want and just explore some of the West. And that's what is so great about that highway is that it's there for everybody to use.
Well, Craig, I'd really like to thank you very much for sharing your thoughts related to the history, the construction, the conception, and the final delivery of the Trans Canada Highway.
Oh, thanks for having me.
My guest today was Craig Baird. His book, Canada's Main Street, The Epic Story of the Trans Canada Highway, was published by Sutherland House in 2025. You've been listening to Witness to Yesterday. To learn more about the Champlain Society, please visit our website at champlainsociety.ca. The best way you can support this podcast is by becoming a subscribing member of the Society. If you like what you've heard, let your friends know by forwarding this podcast through the social media of your choice. You can also send us an email at info@champlainsociety.ca. This podcast is made possible by the members of the Champlain Society who work hard to bring to life original documents in Canadian history. We'd also like to thank a number of Canadian scholarly book publishers, including the University of Toronto Press, UBC Press, and McGill Queen's University Press, for their financial support. My name is Larry Ostola. This interview was recorded on May the 20th, 2026. It was produced by Kevin Ball and supported by the University of Toronto Press Journal team, who also support the Champlain Society.